hopefully you'll still see the campaign of Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russian targets. I think you'll also see increasingly strikes on tankers in the Dark Fleet, the Shadow Fleet, which you're seeing increasingly now. Um, and again, you never know what the Ukrainians are cooking up. There might be another Operation Spiderweb just around the corner. We won't know it until you start seeing videos on Twitter of Russian planes exploding mysteriously.
But do you think the Ukrainians are right in this balancing act that they're carrying out, that the cost of holding Pokrovsk against the cost it is to the Russians to try and take Pokrovsk is, in the Ukrainians' favor at the moment? They're costing the Russians an awful lot more. And do you see that changing? Do you see a decision coming at some stage soon where Ukraine will withdraw from Pokrovsk to take the Russians to their next defensive line?
I do. I think it's always difficult to know the exact ratio, but when it comes down to street by street fighting, it's almost a coin toss, really. Regardless of how well trained your guys are, it's really who gets sight on the enemy first. And you can be the best trained operator in the world, and if the guy who's had 2 days of perfunctory Russian training sees you first and he gets a shot on you with his AK, I mean, it's over. So I think what you've seen, one of the key criticisms of Syrsky, who's the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, is that he's held on to positions for too long. I think, especially in the case of Monohrad, which is to the east of Pokrovsk, that's absolutely true. The Ukrainian soldiers should have been withdrawn from there weeks, maybe months ago, because they are, if not fully encircled, operationally encircled. And I think a full encirclement is potentially on the cards. Some of the, I think it's the 36th Marine Brigade that's in there, and they talked to Ukrainian media, and they essentially said that they're almost entirely encircled at this point. And obviously that leaving troops to be encircled in almost all cases is a terrible thing. You never want to be surrounded by the enemy. I mean, I know that sounds obvious, but there are some cases where you might leave troops to be encircled if you are mounting an imminent counter-offensive, or you think the enemy is overextending themselves. But in this case, it was a slow, determined Russian advance. Everyone saw it coming, and those troops were left there to be encircled. And the biggest problem now is that when they're trying to do casualty evacuations, when they're trying to run logistics into Monohrad and parts of Pokrovsk as well, they're suffering very severe losses. You're also seeing losses amongst the drone pilots, because the drone pilots have to be relatively close to the front line or to the zero line, because you want to be able to strike as far into the enemy rear as possible. So these FPV drones, they have a battery life of about 20-25 minutes, and obviously the further you are behind your lines, the safer you might be, but the damage you can do to the Russians' logistics, because that's what they tend to go for. They go for logistics and they go for infantry forces, is more limited. So you're seeing, because of this kind of encirclement and this grey zone of indeterminate control, don't really have like a defined front line anymore. You just have like a 15-kilometer zone of complete chaos where you have small groups of Russian and Ukrainian troops holding positions and intermingling with each other. And yeah, it's very difficult. And I think, come back to your question, I think the ratio has probably switched to still in the Ukrainians' favor, but not enough in the Ukrainians' favor, in my opinion. And speaking to Ukrainian soldiers that I know that are in that area, that's pretty much what they say to me at the moment.
So we're coming to the end of our time. What's going to happen through the rest of, there's very little of 2025 left. What are your predictions for what's going to happen early 2026?
It's always difficult to make predictions in this kind of conflict. But what I would say is, I think you're going to see a continuing grinding, slow Russian advance, which will be incredibly costly to them, and will gain some territory, but territory that doesn't really make any significant changes in the state of the war. I don't see these peace negotiations going anywhere at this point. The differences between the two sides, actually three sides, because the Americans are making a lot of stupid demands as well at this point. The differences between the sides is just so vast. And I think the other problem that both the Americans and the Russians don't seem to understand is that Zelensky cannot just capitulate on Ukrainians' behalf. The Ukrainians just won't stand for it. If he tried to sign something that was viewed as a surrender, he'd be removed from power. He would not survive. And again, it's understanding the nature of Ukrainian society, understanding that this is not Russia. It's not the United States either. It's a country where the people have significant amounts of power, and if they don't like the actions of the government, they will remove that government, as we've seen multiple times in Ukrainian history. So I think the Russian offensive continues. Peace talks go relatively nowhere. Hopefully, you'll still see the campaign of Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russian targets. I think you'll also see increasingly strikes on tankers in the Dark Fleet, the Shadow Fleet, which you're seeing increasingly now. And again, you never know what the Ukrainians are cooking up. There might be another Operation Spiderweb just around the corner. We won't know it until you start seeing videos on Twitter of Russian planes exploding mysteriously. So, yeah, the other thing I would say is that despite hysterical commentary, there's no danger of the Ukrainian military collapsing. The front line, it's difficult, but it's not difficult to the point where the Russians are in danger of staging a major breakthrough. Even if I don't even know if the Russians could. I don't even know if the Russians could actually exploit a breakthrough in the traditional sense at this point, because their forces have been degraded to the point where they can advance, but they advance using very small groups of infantry. They don't really use that many mechanized assaults and tanks anymore. I mean, they do use them, but when they do use tanks, they're kind of converted into these really Mad Max contraptions where the actual fighting ability of the tank is completely sacrificed to add extra armor onto it. So it's not really a tank anymore. It's kind of like a crappy armored personnel carrier. And to be fair, the armor does protect it against drones, but again, it removes the ability of the tank to fire its main gun, to rotate its turret, or to do anything that a tank would traditionally do. So the question of whether the Russian military could even exploit a breakthrough at this point, I think is open. So yeah, I think that's it.
Jamie Rushton, it's been a real pleasure talking to you once again on Times Radio Frontline today.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.